Hola amigos, ¿cómo están? Sean bienvenidos a un nuevo video. Hoy vamos a estar reaccionando a lo que fue una entrevista que le hicieron a Neil Ferguson, este historiador muy famoso, muy reconocido a nivel mundial, británico, al que hemos comentado ya, sobre el que hemos comentado varias veces en los vivos. Lo hemos mencionado porque sacó algunas notas, hemos leído alguna nota respecto de lo que él opina de Argentina y de Milei, y le han hecho una entrevista, puesto que vino acá a Argentina, le hicieron una entrevista en La Nación, a la que vamos a estar reaccionando ahora mismo porque opina sobre nuestro país, sobre Argentina y sobre el gobierno de Milei. Así que si les parece, vamos a escucharla.
Él es historiador, es escritor británico, tiene mucho, pero mucho escrito sobre el auge del populismo. También tiene una maestría en historia, es doctorado en filosofía. A su vez tiene el rótulo de eminencia, esto por Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, y es conocido por su estilo provocador y accesible. Sostiene que si no fuera provocador, sería aburrido. Neil Ferguson, welcome to Conversations, welcome to La Nación.
I would say it's a great pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is mine. You know, can a broken economy be fixed?
Yes, it can. I can remember as a young man growing up in the United Kingdom, Britain seemed broken in the 1970s. And miraculously, Margaret Thatcher was able to fix it. So I've seen it done. Of course, Argentina has the reputation of being the world's most broken economy. And so the challenge seems that bit harder. But what I have seen since Javier Milei was elected at the end of 2023 is an economic miracle. It is in fact more impressive than what Margaret Thatcher achieved in a shorter space of time. And so to come to Buenos Aires is to see the most broken economy achieving an economic miracle. It's quite remarkable.
How many times have you been here?
I think I've been to Argentina about 6 times in my life, going all the way back to when I was writing The Ascent of Money in, I think, 2006. I don't claim to be an expert, but I've thought deeply about the history of this country.
Bien la aclaración.
And for an economic historian, it's one of the biggest puzzles, perhaps the biggest puzzle in economic history, because as you can see when you come to Buenos Aires, this was once a very wealthy country, one of the richest in the world just over a century ago, and it seemed full of promise. And so the puzzle is what went wrong, and if you can figure that out, then you begin to see what can go right.
You recently wrote that President Milei proves it can. I mean that the economy can be fixed. What are your arguments?
Well, I think if you look back to where the economy was when he was elected, it was on the brink of hyperinflation, which is one of the worst things that can happen to an economy. The economy was shrinking, its performance relative to its peers in South America had been miserable, and it had a track record of financial crisis going back throughout my life, with only occasional periods of ephemeral prosperity. So one has to remember that the starting point was a very dangerous one, with a currency on the brink of complete collapse. And the most important thing that President Milei has done is to understand that fiscal credibility had to be re-established, and he did something astonishing, which was to reduce the fiscal deficit from something like 5% of GDP to 0. He balanced the budget
in 1 year.
And he did it in his first year. Yes. You know, that took Margaret Thatcher 10 years to do the same thing in the United Kingdom in the 1980s. There was also a huge monetary overhang that had to be dealt with. One hears less about that. Plus, you had this extraordinary tangle of regulation that was strangling the economy, dating back through years, decades of Peronist policies. So what we saw in 2024 was what the economist Tom Sargent, who won the Nobel Prize just a few years ago, called a regime change. He changed not just the fiscal policy, not just the monetary policy, he changed almost every aspect of economic policy. And most people, most established economists said, this will cause a catastrophic contraction. There'll be an enormous shrinkage in the economy and high unemployment. No, this didn't happen. On the contrary, the economy in fact grew. If one goes from the beginning of his presidency to the first 12 months it actually didn't shrink, it grew. So that's what's miraculous about this. And I think it shows a very important thing about President Milei, which I understand better today, having met him. He has a very deep understanding of economics. He's extremely widely read, and he's arrived at a radical position of libertarianism. I think he, more than anybody who has ever occupied a presidency anywhere in the world, is committed to the idea of the free market.
Eso es un punto fundamental, ¿eh? Eso es un punto fundamental. Nunca nadie estuvo tan comprometido siendo presidente con la economía del libre mercado. Porque nunca nadie fue o se definió siendo presidente como liberal libertario, y nunca nadie, además, abrazó tan fuertemente esas ideas, de forma tan convencida, tan convincentemente esas ideas, y además, porque es economista. Entonces las entendió realmente. Las entendió realmente. Yo también le digo a Hayek y me fascinó. Pero no entiendo a nivel económico lo que él ha entendido, y además, citando a otros autores y conociendo además Milei, obviamente, todo lo que él conocía, que él dice, enseñé 20 años mal. Enseñé 20 años mal. Tuve que cambiar lo que yo enseñé durante 20 años. Y la honestidad intelectual es tal que él admite. 20 años enseñé mal, entonces dije, a partir de acá hay un cambio. Después de haber descubierto la Escuela Austríaca de Economía.
And the minimal state, the smallest possible state. And because of that deep conviction, he's taken risks that previous reforming presidents just weren't able to take. Most people advised previous presidents, you can't possibly reduce the fiscal deficit by 5 percentage points in a year, don't even think about it. Because he has the courage of his convictions, President Milei has done something that almost everybody said was impossible. And I think Argentine people, especially young Argentines, see this radical man who has the courage of his convictions, who's not afraid, campaigning against the established vested interests, what he calls la casta, who have been the beneficiaries of Peronism, while ordinary people have been the losers. And I think what's remarkable is not just the economic success. In a way, that's inherent in the theory of classical economics. If you move to a free market, things will go better. What's really impressive is the political success. Because in almost every case that I can find, when a government has tried to do something this radical, you could call it shock therapy, the result is usually deep unpopularity very quickly, and usually the end of the government. So he's achieved something which is also politically miraculous. He's done incredibly radical things, and he's remained popular.
And do you see any warning signs in the horizon?
Well, I think he sees, and so do his advisors see, that there are still political opponents. There's still forces, including within the National Assembly, within the Congress, that would like to weaken the fiscal constraint. And so he's well aware of the political challenges that still lie ahead. And there are technical issues involving the exchange rate that are obviously a matter for some concern. But when you compare these challenges with what's already been achieved, I think the prospects are bright. It's not as if the opposition, Peronists, have a good story to tell. It's not as if they can campaign on, let's get back to 200% inflation because this is terrible. Let's go back to negative growth because growth is bad. So I think even allowing for these problems, the opportunity is absolutely huge, because Argentina, if it carries on this path, can start to achieve the kind of sustained growth that it hasn't seen in a century.
And why do you think politics is always a different story? Why do you think they are always different?
Well, Milton Friedman famously said that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And I've spent my career arguing that that is true as far as it goes, but behind the monetary mistakes, there usually lies a political consensus in favor of inflationary policies. Now, it's easy to find people who support...
El concepto del consenso político para mí es fundamental. El consenso político, por lo menos de vuelta a la democracia hasta acá, es lo que nos llevó a donde estamos. Y efectivamente fue un consenso. Eso después lo vamos a desarrollar bien en otro video y lo voy a hablar mucho mejor. Pero eso es que él hable de consenso político es tal cual.
Increased public spending, there nearly always are people who want there to be more public spending, and it's easy to find people who don't want to pay taxes. There are always people who don't want to pay taxes. So the politics of inflation are really the key here. What President Milei has been able to do is to create a coalition of support for low and stable prices, a coalition of support for a balanced budget, a coalition of support for free market solutions. And that is the key here. There is a majority, I think, of the Argentine public that wants growth, that wants market solutions, that wants a balanced budget, that wants price stability. But they've been out of power for many decades. His great success, I think, has been to outmaneuver the people who benefit from inflation, and that includes not only the political opposition, but also the trade unions, other elements of civil society that have been the beneficiaries of the old regime, and also those businesses that have benefited from the various barriers to competition that have arisen over the decades of Peronist rule. So I think the beauty of what he's achieving is that a new political consensus is emerging in Argentina with the support of young people. There are not many places in the world, Jose, where the young are attracted to libertarian solutions, where the young rally behind policies to balance the budget. That's very special. And I think what it shows is that President Milei not only understands the intellectual problem, and I think he understands it very deeply, but he also understands how to get young people enthused.
Sin dudas.
It's not like he's giving lectures to young people about the theories of Milton Friedman. What he's doing is using social media to communicate that he has energy, that he's a radical, that he's bold enough to change the system. And that, I think, is something that many politicians, conservatives, or liberals around the world should be learning from, because it's very rare to see that.
What are the biggest challenges that Milei faces politically to sustain these reforms?
Well, of course, he has a relatively new party that doesn't have a majority in either the lower or the upper house, the Senate. And so he's reliant on other parties for votes. And it's vitally important that he avoids congressional votes to increase public spending and blow out his fiscal commitment. So it's very, very important that at the coming midterm elections, he wins enough support to make sure that any presidential veto can't be overridden by the votes of opposition parties. So I think that's
En eso estamos ahora.
Part two is that he needs to do more than that, because this is just the beginning of reform. It's clear that Argentina needs a radical reform of its tax system, which is tremendously inefficient, with high taxes but lots of evasion. It needs a labor market reform. These things will also need votes. And so I think the main obstacles to his economic miracle continuing are political, and it's going to rely on him and his advisors being as politically skillful as they've been economically skillful. There aren't many external threats, it seems to me, to what Argentina is doing. The International Monetary Fund is giving all the support that it can. It's highly positive about this government. The United States, the most powerful of all the American economies, has in President Trump an ardent fan of President Milei. So it's all about the internal opposition and whether President Milei can overcome it. Now, I think if one looks at the opinion polls, he has the support of ordinary people, and therefore he has a mandate to carry on with this radical change. And if one looks further ahead and imagines he gets a second term, then this economic miracle can go very far indeed. It can turn Argentina from being the proverbial disaster economy, the economy where all financial crises happen at least twice, into being a new model, not only for South America, but a model for the rest of the world. Because remember, the problems that Argentina has are not unique. They were extreme. The problem of high inflation was extreme, and the problem of public sector borrowing was extreme, and the problem of too much public debt, all of that was extreme. But other countries have versions of these problems. And so a success in Argentina sends a signal to the whole world that there is a way to address the problem of an excessively large state. There is a way to reduce the state burden on economic activity and to release the entrepreneurial spirits, which I think are very much here in Argentina. I'm struck by the new generation of businesses that are springing up here. Young Argentinians are no longer fleeing the country, but are actually seeing that there's opportunity here, and that's very exciting.
It's really exciting. Why do you think Milei is delivering a man-made miracle that should gladden the heart of every classical economist?
Well, if you're someone like me who grew up reading Adam Smith and believing that the key ideas of Adam Smith are right, there aren't many places in the world that cheer you up these days. Because even a conservative administration like Donald Trump's does not seem at all committed to free trade. Everybody in Europe and elsewhere talks about industrial policy and how can we be more like the Chinese. And so there aren't many governments that are pursuing free market solutions of the sort that I think are the most convincing and the most likely to succeed. In fact, there are some countries, including my own, the United Kingdom, which seem to be determined to repeat the mistakes of the 1970s, with slow growth, with an inflation problem, and public sector finances in a permanent deficit. So the fact that Argentina is going its own way under President Milei's leadership, that it's aiming to have a balanced budget, that it's aiming to bring inflation down and achieve price stability, and above all, that it's aiming for free market solutions to unleash the entrepreneurial spirits is very uplifting, because there aren't many other countries, in fact, there are hardly any other countries that are taking this path. If it turns out to work, and I think it is already working, then the rest of the world is going to have to sit down and realize that there are still incredibly important answers that date back to Adam Smith, that are there in the classical school of economics, that apply everywhere.
And how do you analyze the previous Peronism government and its inflation rate?
Well, as I said, Argentina narrowly avoided hyperinflation. And I don't think perhaps President Milei and his ministers get enough credit for dealing with what was a national emergency. The currency came extremely close to collapse. It wasn't just that there was a large deficit, there was a huge monetary overhang, which could have exploded into hyperinflation if they had made the wrong decisions. So this was a very, very dangerous situation, and one has to condemn the previous government for letting it get into such a mess. I began my career studying the hyperinflation that swept Germany in 1923. That was a disaster that paved the way for the rise of Hitler. So Argentina came very close to that kind of monetary disaster when the peso could have lost all its value. And it's extremely lucky that it was avoided through extremely effective early decision-making. If one looks back on the record of the Kirchner era, it seems to me that it's an indictment of the notion at the heart of Peronism that the government really should be responsible for the economy, that it should pick winners, that it should have favorites, that there should be access between business and government in ways that all too often descend into corruption. That has been really a chronic problem for Argentina going all the way back to the origins of Peronism. So I think this is the moment when Argentina says, okay, that era is over. We're never going to go back there because it didn't work and it made us poor. I mean, just look at the way the poverty rate has fallen since President Milei's policies began to take effect. Finally, we're seeing people getting out of poverty who seem doomed to be stuck in it by the old system. So I think this is, as I said, a real regime change that consigns Peronism and especially Kirchnerism to the dustbin of Argentine history.
And can Milei succeed where Mauricio Macri failed?
Well, I think Mauricio Macri had a lot of the right ideas, but was restrained and perhaps too cautious in the way he went about executing them, because he was advised, don't go too quickly, don't take big risks. And I understand why he took that advice. I think that was the consensus of the advice he received at the time. So what is extremely important about what Mauricio Macri did was that he showed gradualism can't work. And he showed that only a drastic and revolutionary approach, in 100 days, you do all the most dramatic reforms. That's the only way. And so maybe the reality is that you couldn't have had Milei without Macri. You couldn't really have got to the radical solution if you hadn't tried gradualism and seen it sadly fail politically.
Pero es muy probable.
How was your meeting with President Milei and also with Pier Paolo Barbieri from Voilà, that's your partner from his company?
Well, I sit on the board of Voilà. I was one of its co-founders. Pier Paolo Barbieri and I go way back to when he was a student at Harvard and I was his professor. I think I can date my interest in Argentina from our first meeting when he came to my office hours and said, "Professor, please stop making jokes about my country in your lectures."
Wow.
And I said, "I can't, because your country is the butt of nearly all jokes in financial history. But perhaps," I remember saying, "we can do something about that."
It's so sad to listen that, but it's so
But
real.
that was how
It's
it
so
seemed.
real.
That was how it seemed.
Yes.
And if you read my book, The Ascent of Money,
Yes,
there's a whole
I read
section
it.
on Argentina. My first visit took me to the slums of
You have a
Quilmes,
special section from Argentina
Because-
and from the crisis.
because Argentina illustrates that a very wealthy economy can be turned into a poor economy by the wrong policies and the wrong ideas about economics. What's exciting is to come to Buenos Aires again in 2025, meet President Milei, and discover, this was my first meeting with him, that he's not only an extraordinarily dynamic character with a huge social media following, but he's also a deeply thoughtful intellectual. I think President Milei must be one of the best read, if not the best read, world leader, particularly when it comes to
Tremendo lo que
economics.
dice, ¿eh?
But he's not a narrowly specialized professor. What fascinated me in our conversation was that although he's thought deeply about every aspect of economics, he also understands the political realities that he has to deal with. I asked him, "What have you learnt that you didn't know before about politics
Buena pregunta.
since you became president?" And he gave an extremely interesting answer, that he had learned that it was much worse than he'd realized, that the obstacles to reform within the political system were much more intractable than he'd previously appreciated. When you consider what he previously thought, which was pretty negative, you realize what a shock it's been for him to encounter the reality of trying to run a country like Argentina. I was deeply impressed. This country is very fortunate to have somebody with such a powerful intellect sitting in that president's office, pursuing the good of the country, not in order to enrich himself. He clearly has no interest in that, but because he passionately believes that Argentina can be a model for radical free market solutions. It's very inspiring, to be honest.
Podés con IA. Podés con KPMG.
Nos pusieron publicidad, amigos.
And how important it is to have an economist as president.
Well, economists are not necessarily the best presidents.
Why? Why
because
not?
by and large, the economics profession says in response to every question, on the one hand, on the other. And the typical economist does not make a great president. But this is what makes President Milei so unusual. He's not the typical economist. President Milei is a dissident in the economics profession who has spent his whole career arguing for the most radical libertarian solutions, the most market-based solutions to the problems that we confront in every society. So he's a very, very unusual kind of economist who, in an ideal utopian world, would have almost no state at all. The minimal state would be his ideal. But what I really liked about him was this pragmatism that is combined with his idealism. He's really understood how to get things done in this country. He's understood how to use social media. Can you name another economist with that kind of a following on social media? So I think there's something very exceptional about this man. He's got a powerful intellect. We had a conversation today which was far more technical on the question of trade than I had expected to have. But we also had a conversation about the practical realities of power. And when I asked him whether things that, for example, he disagreed with President Trump on when it came to trade, because they have very different views of trade. President Milei is not a believer in tariffs. He's a believer in free trade. He gave a brilliant answer, which was that you have to see trade policy in the context of geopolitics. And from that point of view, if one looks at the world today with the United States here, China there, Russia seeking to dominate Europe, then it can make sense for the United States to do what it's doing. So he's a remarkable man who's far more than an economist. He is also a strategic thinker with a very coherent argument about what Argentina's foreign policy should be. So I was very surprised and very pleasantly surprised by what I learned today.
And what is your view of President Trump's administration?
President Trump is a radically different figure. Perhaps all they have in common is a great ability to use social
yo diría
media.
que algunas cosas más.
President Trump has a different set of problems. The United States thinks 9% is a high inflation rate. That was the peak of inflation under President Biden. American voters are preoccupied not only with the issue of illegal immigration, they're also preoccupied with the challenge that China has posed in hollowing out their manufacturing over the last 2 decades. So President Trump has a different set of challenges. And I think if one looks back to the events of November last year, when American voters had a choice between Kamala Harris and continuing the policies of the Biden administration or returning to the more radical policies, the populist policies of Donald Trump, American voters did the right thing. They made the right decision. That was the choice. And so far, I think one has to say that the pessimists who said that President Trump's tariff policies would cause a financial crisis or an economic crisis have been proved wrong. I mean, we're now in a situation where President Trump has imposed tariffs we haven't seen since the 1930s, and the stock market is up. So the economists who were on the other side of that debate currently seem to me to be losing.
But you also wrote that you were wrong to call Donald Trump a would-be tyrant.
I became extremely worried about where President Trump was going back at the time of January the 6th, 2021, when he challenged the result of the 2020 election. But what I know now is a lot different from what I knew then. And I think it's less and less plausible that President Trump was trying to overthrow that election, and more plausible that what happened in Washington that day was a kind of fiasco, as much due to bad policing as to any malign intent on President Trump's part.
Yeah.
In the end, one has to revise one's view, and I did revise it. And actually, 2 years after writing those words, I predicted in early 2023 that President Trump would be re-elected and should be re-elected. So as so often in politics and in economics, when the facts change, you have to change your mind. And we've learned a lot since January 6, 2021 and what really happened that day. And it's made me change my view.
Excelente lo de la honestidad intelectual. Fíjense la honestidad intelectual de Neil Ferguson en eso.
When the facts change, you have to change your mind. I love that phrase. When Elon Musk tried to imitate Milei earlier this year, his chainsaw was swiftly blunted by the forces of inertia. And what is your opinion on his role and relationship with Trump?
Well, I'm a great admirer of Elon Musk. I've known him for many years. He's another brilliant mercurial figure, one of the standout personalities of our era. And one has to acknowledge that there really are no other entrepreneurs who come close to achieving what he has achieved. Just think of the incredible feat of building not only Tesla as the first really successful electric vehicle company, but think of Starlink, think of SpaceX. The achievements are just astounding, and the appetite for risk is second to none. He also played a key political role last year. I think it was vitally important for President Trump that Elon Musk came in unequivocally in support of him, signaling that the tech elite was willing to back President Trump. All of this was great. What Elon got wrong, and I think he would be the first to admit it, was to think that the federal government was no different from Twitter, and that he could apply the same approach to the federal government as he'd taken to Twitter, which was radically to reduce the workforce and make the federal government more efficient. That's harder than it looks. Because if you think Argentine bureaucracy is entrenched and difficult to manage, it's got nothing on the federal bureaucracy of the United States in Washington, D.C. So Elon borrowed a chainsaw from President Milei, but it turned out not to work as well as the chainsaw has worked in Buenos Aires. That doesn't mean the idea was wrong. There clearly is a need to make the federal government more efficient. It clearly costs far too much money. That's why the US is running a deficit greater than 6% of GDP every year, as far as the eye can see. That's a larger deficit than President Milei inherited from his predecessor. That's not sustainable. At some point, and I hope soon, President Trump is going to do something about that. So I think Elon had the right idea, but he underestimated those forces of inertia in Washington that were determined to reject him a little bit like an organ in a transplant that the body rejects.
And do you agree with President Milei that socialism is the root of all failures?
I have been opposed to socialism all my adult life.
All your life?
Not least because I saw its effects in my native Scotland, which to a large extent was a socialist economy when I was growing up. Then when I traveled to Eastern Europe as a graduate student and saw the realities of life in the Soviet Union and East Germany, I realized that socialism, and especially communism, really were the causes not just of evil, cruelty, and the absence of liberty, but also of poverty. So he's right about that, and I've long agreed.
Why do you consider the Argentine state as a beast?
Well, it is a kind of beast in the sense that it's been parasitic on this economy with all of its natural resources, all of its potential, for the better part of a century, dragging it down. You travel around this city and you see magnificent buildings dating from the late 19th century and the earlier 20th century. And then you realize that it all stopped, that growth stopped, that Argentina didn't keep up with its peers, that it fell behind. And it ended up being, as we said earlier, the butt of jokes in lectures on financial history. And one can only explain this by saying something went wrong with the political economy, that you ended up with a coalition of interests, that was really what Peronism created, that had no interest in economic growth and did not care if the economy stagnated and did not mind if there were periodic bouts of inflation because the vested interests were okay and they made money. So that's the essence of a dysfunctional state, when it benefits only the special interests and not the people.
I have the three last questions because you have to return home. What lessons from history should Argentina keep in mind?
I think the most important lesson for any drastic reform like these is you have to keep going. You can't quit after 2 years. It's a multi-year process. For these changes to really deliver the benefits of market reforms, Argentine voters have to stay the course. And that means they have to stay the course not just past the midterms, but they have to re-elect President Milei and give him a second term. It will be a 2-term endeavor to transform Argentina's political economy. So lesson number 1, don't quit too soon. You have to keep going. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
The whole world needs an Argentinian success story. What are these countries' chances in the current global economy order, and what are the risks?
Well, I think the chances are actually very good indeed. Unlike in the first Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, when South America became a battleground, in the second Cold War between the United States and China, South American countries can have the best of both worlds. They can have good relations with the United States, but they can also trade with China. As long as China doesn't try and control their economies, China's a buoyant market for the exports of countries like Argentina. So I think the conditions are extremely good, very positive indeed, especially when you consider all the resources that Argentina still has to develop. Vast energy resources that have barely been tapped. And of course, this is one of the great agricultural economies of the world. I can confirm that Argentine steak is the best in the world. I had an absolutely delicious dinner last night in this city. Not to mention tourism. People should come and visit this beautiful country. So the outlook is actually very bright. The opportunities are there. The country is endowed with great natural resources and talented young people. It just has to stay the course politically for all of this to produce a new era of prosperity, such as we haven't seen in over a century here.
The last one, what's the importance of the past to predict the future?
We don't have anything else to go on. Models, whether it's political science or economics, will generally get it wrong.
Sí.
When you're trying to understand where a country is going, the most important thing to know first is its history. So my role as a historian is to say, look, here's what's gone wrong in Argentine history over the past century. Here's why it underperformed, it disappointed. What do you need to change? These are the things you need to change. And above all, you need to change a political economy which extracted resources from the state for the benefit of La Casta, as President Milei says. You have to turn back to the market institutions that will deliver prosperity to everybody, including those who are at the bottom of the social heap, not only to the elites, but to ordinary people. That's what history teaches us. In many ways, the history of the world since the Industrial Revolution is a history of remarkable prosperity, unprecedented improvements in not only wealth, but also life expectancy. Argentina has underachieved relative to its peers, even relative to a neighbor like Chile, and therefore it's time to learn lessons from the last 100 years and stop repeating the mistakes that have produced a cycle of inflation and debt default and disappointment. I believe Argentina reached the point in 2023, and I said this as soon as President Milei appeared on the scene. The first time I heard of him, I said, this is the man, because Argentinian people have had enough of these failures. They've just reached the point that enough is enough. And so that's how economic miracles happen. When you get a consensus in favor of radical reform, and when even the young people say, you know what, things have to change, and they have to change fast, and they have to change radically. So this is a fantastic moment in the history of Argentina, one of the best moments in your lifetime or in mine, and we should all celebrate it, and the world should watch. The world has a lot to learn from what is happening here.
It was a great pleasure to receive you here in Argentina, and I hope you have a safety return home.
Thanks very much, Jose. It's lovely to be here. Thanks.
Bueno, amigos, la verdad que muy buena la entrevista. Fíjense que es corta, duró poco más de media hora, es cortita. Así que la verdad que imperdible, por eso yo estuve viendo un fragmentito y dije, no, esto lo voy a directamente, lo grabo, lo subo como video, así lo podemos compartir. Porque hay mucha gente que ni siquiera conoce a Neil Ferguson. Yo lo conozco hace años por un libro que me regalaron que se llama Civilización. Perdón, Occidente y el Resto. Civilización, Occidente y el Resto. Que ya se lo he mostrado la tapa y todo acá. Lo leí hace años y bueno, y ubicaba por eso a quién es él. Y la verdad que es fantástico. Lo último que les muestro es esto. Acá él dice, la versión en video de mi entrevista con La Nación sobre los asombrosos logros de Milei en Argentina ya está disponible en inglés. Bien. Y acá Milei citando justamente en La Nación, fenómeno barrial, Neil Ferguson, este cambio de régimen condena al peronismo y al kirchnerismo al tacho de basura de la historia. Buenísima. Bien. Lo compartió el propio Milei. Así que amigos, ese es Neil Ferguson. Buenísimas las opiniones. Aparte un tipo que no dice yo me conozco mejor a Argentina que ustedes. Él dice yo no soy ningún experto, pero él trata el crecimiento económico, lo ha tomado de ejemplo a Argentina en sus libros, o sea que ha leído sobre Argentina, y me parece que las opiniones, la verdad que estuvieron realmente muy centradas y muy bien, muy acertadas. Amigos, eso es todo por hoy. Nos vemos mañana como siempre. Presten atención, como siempre les digo, a los vivos. Presten atención a estos videos que vamos a estar subiendo. Voy a tratar incluso de hacer videos de 10 minutos, 15 minutos para que, bueno, haya gente que también los pueda ver. Muchas veces la gente no ve videos muy largos. Y dejen sus me gusta, por favor, suscríbanse al canal y gracias a quienes colaboran. Yo saqué de acá abajo la colaboración por una cuestión de los subtítulos. Ahí está. Gracias a quienes colaboran con el canal. Muchísimas gracias por colaborar siempre, que eso es lo que ayuda a que estemos todos los días acá. Les mando un abrazo enorme.